I was saying that this class has, well, every class I teach, I just go from wherever it feels like it should go. We'll just focus this the way it needs to be focused, including questions that you may have, or comments, or experiences that you feel would contribute to the conversation. Many of you, I know as a fact, have had profound experiences of people leaving this planet. And sometimes those experiences are really the beginning of any conversation we want to have on this, because it's where you're starting. So we'll pray and meditate for a few minutes, and above all, we'll all try to attune and unite our energies so that we can draw the inspiration that we need, okay? So, Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, humbly we bow to all. Help us to attune ourselves, that we may receive your guidance, your wisdom, your joy, and your unconditional love. We are your children. Guide us and bless us. Om. Peace. Amen. Let's meditate now for a few minutes. If I would like to ask if there's any of you who have something particular that you'd like me to talk about in the death and dying process today, so that I could focus the class a little bit in that direction. Does anybody have any? Yes, Ellen.
As I was thinking about the class, and I was grateful for the topic, because as I've gotten older, I've had a few friends die, and you see people go through this process, so you think about what it's going to be like for yourself. Mm-hmm. And so in the process of thinking of that, I thought of a couple of things. Number one is, how do you prepare for that? Mm-hmm. And it made me think, and I don't know why, it's kind of analogous to when I was a small child, and I was raised Catholic, as you know, but as you prepared to make your first communion and to go make your first confession, they took you through a process called examination of conscience, mm-hmm. so that you would look at your life, so you would know.
And you're 6 at this point, or 7?
7, yeah,
okay.
7, in the 2nd grade. But I think it's the same thing with dying, in that, you know, I feel like, well, now's the time to examine my life and see what's unfinished, or what I need to change, or what I didn't do.
Right.
So it made me think of that. Just because you had the topic there, this all came up for me. So I would like for you to address that.
Well, that's superb. That's an excellent way to focus things. Let's take a few other questions or comments before we go there. Anyone else have anything they'd like us to talk about? Doug?
I would appreciate it if you could address the difference between what is happening apparently when someone is in the process of passing at the physical level, as opposed to what is happening at the soul level.
Oh, yeah.
And also to the role of medication
in all of that.
At those 2 different levels.
Oh, wow. Medication, what's really happening to the soul, how to examine the conscience. Okay, let's... Anything else? Any other small topics that you all want to talk about? David?
I have noticed my father turned 80 last year.
Uh-huh.
And he's, a lot of his friends are starting to leave this world. Mm-hmm. And I feel a little, if you were to sit there talking to him, you wouldn't know it, but I've known him for a while. He's stopped.
You've known him for a while?
He stopped talking about death.
He stopped talking.
Stopped talking about it. He doesn't like to broach that subject at all, which would have been comfortable for him in the past.
I see. Interesting.
And I just more and more recently, I feel like he's starting to be a little anxious about it.
Interesting.
And I'm wondering if there's something you can say that can help me, help him, if at all.
Yeah, good questions. Okay, anyone else? I'll take one or two more before we'll sort of figure we've got enough, at least until the break. Okay. What is your name?
My name is Jen.
Say it again.
Jen.
Jen,
Yeah.
nice to meet you, Jen.
There are a broad spectrum of things already mentioned, but if there's time, I would love to hear or to talk about the grieving process of losing somebody and the ones who are left, and how to best approach that in ourselves and to help other people through that.
That's very good. If in the course of saying other things I don't get to that, be sure and remind me, because it's the other side of the whole story, isn't it? Yes, of course. Over here, Divya, here. And remind me of your name also? Crystal. Okay.
I'm kind of piggybacking on Doug's question about the medication. I'm specifically wondering if you could speak to whether medication interrupts the soul's process, or that does it change their consciousness in a way that is negative, or you know, something like that. Like, I'm wondering, how do drugs interfere possibly with the death process, and is there some information that as meditation teachers, or as people who may be hoping to educate people about medication and death and how they interact with each other, like something that we could,
sure, those are big
something
questions.
that's easy to digest that you can say to people around the death of their loved one, and whether or not medication is appropriate, or in terms of on the soul level, not like appropriate for their body, but you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean.
Okay.
I'm asked that question. That question comes up all the time. If there's one more burning request, otherwise I think we can go for a while. Okay, Sarah has a question.
I was with my father, who was dying, in his room, and I was alone. And before he died, I remember I heard whispering.
Whispering?
Yeah, like people talking.
You heard not him, but you heard other whispering?
Yeah. So I am just wondering, you know, what should I do? I was, you know.
How fascinating. All right. Okay, that's enough. But everything will come in. Let me think about this for a minute. I think I was sharing, I think it was on my Tuesday night class this week. You have to forgive me, because as often as I talk, I have to try to forget it. Otherwise I'd be mad with all the different thoughts in my head. But I know recently I was sharing a story that I've shared with some of you. Some of you are a new audience for me, so this is wonderful. That when I became interested and I became committed to the spiritual path when I was 18, which was now a good long time ago. And I have certain, you know how it is, you have certain moments are more vivid in your consciousness as you look back, significant transitions. And I got onto the spiritual path through a book by Swami Vivekananda, who talked about the same principles that Yogananda teaches, but I didn't meet Master and Swami Kriyananda for a couple of more years, 4 more years actually. But the teachings that I read of, of Ramakrishna through Vivekananda totally satisfied me. It's what I had been looking for my whole life. And I recognized it. I just recognized it from past lives. But one of the things that happened, I think right after I learned about the possibility of self-realization, therefore meditation, therefore reincarnation, and all of the things that implies, which has a huge impact on our relationship to death. Because if we're on a soul's journey, which is longer than one incarnation. And if death itself is just another phase of that journey, and then you just pick it up in another place, it's altogether different than the basic Western idea that we're just born, who knows why or from where we come. Then at a certain point, the life force runs out, and we just go somewhere else. This isn't directly answering your question yet, David, but when my mother was in the last years of her life, she had Parkinson's for 15 years. And in the last few years, it got, being ill that long actually built her character, and she reluctantly admitted that it did. She'd been willful and a little spoiled before that, and having to fight as hard as she did for all those years just to keep going. She said, put it to me this way, this disease, I hate to admit it, she said, but this disease has been the making of me. And she was right. But when I could see that the end was coming, my parents had no relationship to the life that I live, except to be, relatively speaking, supportive. But when I thought to broach the subject with my parents, I asked my mother if she was afraid of dying, how she felt about dying. And first I have to say that I became anxious in the last years of her life because the struggle with Parkinson's is pretty dramatic. And I was always anxious. They lived in Los Angeles, but I was going back and forth even several times a week toward the end. But I remember at one point my mother got real annoyed with me. She said it like this: every time I cough, you think I'm about to die. I'm not about to die. I have a lot of life force left in me. And I realized she was exactly right. Every time she did anything, I was hovering like this. She was so just annoyed with me because she was. I was thinking, I was projecting upon her my both preoccupation and interest in dying, and she was just living her life. So when I asked her about how she felt, I think it must have been a presidential election year because somehow politics entered into it. And I remember she said, well, I'm not afraid, but I hate to think of all this going on and me not being here to be a part of it. I thought, well, that's an attitude, And that was 100% of the conversation I ever had with her about dying. That was her point of view, and there it was. As it happened, I was in Europe when she died, and she didn't die suddenly in the sense that her health was deteriorating, but she did leave suddenly. She just had a small seizure. They put her in the hospital. The next morning, my sister calls up and says, Mom died. I said, my response, good for her. Her body was just disintegrating. It was going to get really ugly. Good for her. She just saw what was happening and moved on, even though she lamented it, Okay, now going back to when I was 18. I remember, even though I had no experience of death at that point. In fact, it was many years in my life, well into my 30s, before anybody I knew died. My grandparents may have died, but they were very distant. They lived on the other side of the country. I rarely saw them. They just weren't a part of my life. One of my grandparents died. But it just was no part of my life. However, we have all died, if we accept reincarnation, which is the premise of this conversation. We've all died literally millions of times. We've all been through the human process. Most of the time we probably age and then we die. So knowledge of death and actual soul memory of the experience of death is with us. There is much more about who we are that we don't know, or don't remember, than the tiny little portion that we do remember. The rest of it is blocked. I certainly find, as the Bible says, sufficient unto the day is the trouble thereof. This one incarnation is enough to make me pretty tense and anxious. Imagine if we had all of them. So we don't. But I knew at the age of 18 that death would come. And I didn't know it theoretically, just theoretically. I knew it in my being that death would come. I also knew, and when I look back, it was very interesting to me because now I've been with maybe a dozen people who've passed away. So I actually, I know what that process looks like from this side. And I had a pretty vivid idea of it when I was 18, even without experience. And I knew that as a person dies, of course, they become more and more focused on the trajectory of their own consciousness and the world that's opening in front of them. Sarah's comment about hearing the whispering is really marvelous because many people articulate the presence of loved ones, mostly loved ones on the other side, who communicate with them just like we're communicating. And the fact that Sarah could hear them whispering is just absolutely wonderful. But from this side, it gets narrower and narrower. A person, if there's a process, they stop relating, they stop wanting to relate. And then they also stop being able to relate. It sort of goes together. And so even if you're right in the room with someone dying, you suddenly feel this tremendous separation because they're basically going somewhere that you can't go unless you have super consciousness and can travel with them, which of course I don't have. But I thought of it at the age of 18 from my side of it. And I thought of it in the context of no matter what happened in my life, and I was unmarried at that time, but I planned to marry, I planned to have lots of children. I sort of saw myself eventually as the matriarch of some huge bohemian clan, which is how I always visualized it, Just this huge world of artistic, creative, slightly offbeat, energy. Yeah, like, surprise! But I also knew that no matter how many people were in my life, no matter how close they were, no matter how many people loved me or I loved, no matter what I accomplished, there would be a moment, and when that moment came, it would be now, when I would be absolutely alone with my consciousness. Because that is what happens, isn't it? We are absolutely alone with our consciousness all the time. That's what I've finally figured out. But at that time, I saw it more because of the inability to relate to the world around us. Now, if I feel anxious in my consciousness, I can still use my body and my mind to create distractions for myself. One of the authors writing about dying, Stephen Levine, who was one of the pioneers in this 40 years ago when all this was just coming forward, he talked about what happens to a dying person and how often there'll be a period of time, if there's a longer process, even a week or a few days, where the dying person will become very agitated. And then usually, thank you God, there's a relaxation of that agitation. But he described it as I had experienced it in my imagination when I was 18, is that normally a problem arises in our consciousness. I feel anxious, I feel worried about something, I have a bad memory, I have a memory of a bad experience, or my body's uncomfortable, something. And we solve the problem on the mental or the physical level. Nowadays you turn on Netflix, or whatever it is that you do. I open a novel. I've read 17 books in a particular series, over the last year. Just a mystery series that, entertains me. But we do something that changes the energy. When you begin to die, and you absolutely can't move, and gradually you can't speak, maybe you can't see, you can't hear, the problem of consciousness has to be solved on the level of consciousness. And of course, anybody who meditates or knows anything about an inner life has at least a step forward in knowing it's possible, and preferably having profound techniques that you can actually use. Or anyone who has a relationship with God. You don't have to be a yogi. You know that there's another dimension. Then you're more adept at solving the problems of consciousness on the level of consciousness. Most people have to surrender to it, and often discover that in surrender there's peace on the other side of that. But when I was 18, thinking about this, realizing that that's what it would come down to, no matter how long I lived, no matter how successfully I lived, there would be that point. And that for me has been extremely powerful incentive ever since these 50-some years. Is it 50? Yeah, it's 50, more than 50 years since then. So even though I do live an active life and I'm not obsessed with death, everything is based on the fact that the actual issue is consciousness, and sooner or later, all problems of consciousness have to be solved on that level. So Ellen asked the question, to my mind, it's like, also, another aspect that Stephen Levine recommended when he started doing seminars for terminally ill people. Again, this was all 40 years ago, when it was all very new. People never talked about those things in the same way. Now it's, thank you God, it's become, hospice is normal. But he would have you make, if you had a terminal diagnosis, he would have you make the two lists. Again, some of you have heard me say this. He would have the people in his seminar who were all facing a terminal diagnosis make a list of everything that they would miss out on because they were going to die sooner than they expected. All the obvious things. I'll never see Paris in the spring. I'll never dance at my daughter's wedding. I'll never hold my grandchild. Maybe I'll never get married. It depends how young you are. Maybe I'll never go to college. Who knows? And of course, people would make those lists, and they would be tear-stained, and it would be a multi-Kleenex experience as you write down all the heartbreaks, which are extremely real. I'm not in any way diminishing them. Then he would have you make a second list, which is all the things you feel that you get to not have to face because you're going to die instead. And everyone would assume that it was the heartbreaking disappointments that they had to work with. But the actual fulcrum point of their consciousness was the things they thought they could avoid. And because that's the, I'll put it this way, in the traditional Sanatan Dharma of the teachings of which this church and all self-realization paths are based, they say that Maya has three, this illusion of the world we live in, has three primary areas of delusion that ensnare us. They're usually called sex, wine, and gold. Okay? Sexuality is everything that has to do with thinking that that the physical body is our reality, and if we enjoy the physical body, we'll have everything that we want. Gold is obviously money, but money also means whether we feel we have power in this world or whether we feel helpless in this world. And money gives people the illusion of power. I've observed something about people who inherit large sums of money early. Not all of them, but some of them. I've observed, unfortunately, they never develop willpower because every time things get tough, they can just go somewhere else. Not uniformly, but I've seen that, unfortunately. Money gives them the power to follow the third delusion, which is called wine. But what that means is anything that dulls our consciousness and gives us the impression that the way to stop suffering is to lower my awareness. Whether I take drugs, whether I read 17 novels, little mystery stories, whether I watch television, whether I eat sugar, whether I overindulge in sexuality, whether I drink wine. But the whole point is, I hurt. I have a problem of consciousness. I'm just going to dull myself down so I don't have to feel it. The problem is the actual direction of freedom is expanded consciousness. Now, but that desire to dull ourselves rather than to transcend is extremely deep. We don't have to be drug addicts to be absolutely a part of it. Someone was talking to me about it yesterday, using back my own words. You know, I just would like to go to bed and pull the covers up over my head and just not come out. When I first returned from Israel, the first week of February, I pretty much didn't get out of bed for about 5 days. I was tired. I will have to give myself credit. It was a very, there was a lot of energy output. But I just didn't want to be here. I wanted to still be in Jerusalem. So my way of compromising was to not exactly be here. Just to but you know, I just watched myself do it. It wasn't terrible, but I just thought if I pretended that reality wasn't there, then maybe when I came out it wouldn't be there. But it was. And eventually I grew bored. As someone says, it's not that easy to lay down and die. You get hungry. You know, you try to, psychologically or physically, but you know, you get restless. It's just not that easy to do it because it's a delusion. It's not a reality. Okay, so all of us, you know, we're in this spectrum, and if we have this idea that those three delusions, that's what we're doing here. And and we'll make a certain amount of progress in one incarnation, and there's a kind of a rhythm, apparently, to one life. And whenever we've gone as far as we can go in that incarnation, whether it's 4 years old or 17 or 94, there's a certain karmic trajectory that will be here until we've finished learning what we can learn, till we've used this body and this particular set of circumstances as much as possible, and then we'll just take it off, just like I would take off this sweater. Swamiji said to me, I think it was after my mother died, I was in Rome. I had just gone, she died on a Tuesday morning. I left for Europe on Sunday evening. I saw my mother on Sunday. I left that night. She went in, she had a seizure. She went into the hospital on Monday, and then on Tuesday morning she was gone. And I happened to be with Swami. And I didn't come back. My sister, there was just no real reason to. You know, my father had begun to lose his mind a little bit, and everything was fine, so I didn't come back. But I was asking Swami, I'll just give you a piece of this, which is out of the sequence, but I had a very good relationship with my parents, and in the sense that they were very good parents. They were very committed, they were very extremely honorable, very ethical, and refined living, and just, I can say many, many things. It wasn't a powerful emotional tie, actually, to the point that it concerned me slightly. And when I asked Swamiji about it, he said, sometimes a yogi deliberately chooses a family environment that doesn't have that strong a karmic hold on them, so that they can find their spiritual family and not feel divided. So that was the relation. My sister and I are quite close, and my brother and I also. But my parents, I had a very positive, very respectful. But we were. They could live their life, I could live mine, and I didn't always feel like I had to be there. So I was very dutiful. When I asked Swamiji, how do I respond? He said, have they ever interfered with your spiritual life? I said, never. He says, then you must remain loyal and respectful to them, which I did. And I took care of them. I did everything, and I did it out of love. It wasn't hard. But when my mother died, I asked Swamiji, will she still be conscious of me? I said, if I stop thinking about her, will her feelings be hurt? Because I was worried, because I could just go on. I didn't have, and we'll talk about the grieving process. We lived very separate lives. There was no part of me that needed to grieve. I was happy for her. She'd courageously left her body at a good moment. And he said, at her level of consciousness, she'll be vaguely aware of this world, but she won't have a clear sense of the details. It was interesting. Now, just because I've started talking about this, I'll mention, she was very attached to my father, 56 years of marriage, and very positive marriage. My father lived 2 years longer, and he kind of checked out mentally a year or two before my mother passed. It was just a little too much for him. And he became very sweet and very cheerful, and he went on 2 years. Then he died, and then my sister and brother and I were with my father when he died. The next morning, the three of us said something to each other we'd never said before. In those 2 years, whenever we thought about my mother, she felt anxious and restless. And all three of us had to keep our minds away from our mother because her consciousness seemed unsettled. As soon as my father died, it was different. All three of us felt that Mom was finished now. I think she was just so mad at him. Where are you? You know, like, why aren't you here? And as soon as he crossed over, then she could just let this world go. But she couldn't let it go until he crossed over. This is my belief as to what happened. Isn't it interesting how all these things, now I present these things as, they're not super conscious, but they're intuitive perceptions, supported by a few other realities. Now, in that conversation with Swamiji, we started talking about death and just sort of what it is and what it isn't. And I was commenting about how my spontaneous remark about my mother dying was good for her, which is a weird sort of thing to say, most people would think. But I thought it was courageous of her to recognize that body just wasn't worth clinging to, just go on. And Swami just said very casually, nothing happens when you die. He said, people think it's such a big event, he said, but nothing happens. And what he meant by that was, there's no escape. There's no escape from consciousness. We imagine because the consciousness loses contact with this world, we imagine that the dying or the dead person has gone unconscious, but they haven't. They've just shifted their consciousness to another place. And especially anyone who meditates or is a spiritual person, anyone who knows that there's a reality beyond the physical. Master actually said that people who believe only that consciousness comes from the brain, and I love the way Master put it, feel obligated when the brain dies to go unconscious. That's how he put it. It's like, oh, my brain is dying, so I guess I can't be aware anymore. And he said they go into the astral world, but he said they never really wake up in the astral world because they don't believe you can be awake without a brain. So he called it, he said, it's kind of a gray dream. And they rest a while. They get some intoxication. They get to rest. And he said they wake up when they get back into another body. And then when they have a brain again, they think they can be conscious. Isn't that extraordinary? There's another one I heard, and this is not from Master. This is just from one of those many channeled books, and so I have no idea if this is true. But somebody's grandfather died and is talking to the granddaughter, and I mean, this could be true, I just don't know if it is. And the granddaughter's communing psychically with her grandfather, and grandfather talks about where he is, and he's in some relatively expanded astral world. And then she says, what about Grandma? Oh, Grandma, he sort of sighs like this. She's sitting at the feet of God, singing with choirs of angels. Meaning, that was her view of what heaven would be, so that's where she is. You know, he's in some expanded world, and she's in some church somewhere, just doing what she thinks she's supposed to do. I don't know if it's true, but it's apocryphal, if not. So anyway, Swami's saying to me, you know, nothing happens when you die. He said, your consciousness, in fact, your consciousness is all you have. So if your consciousness is sweet, if your consciousness is free, if it's expanded, if you know about angelic realms, if you've lived a refined life, if your pleasures are subtle rather than gross, we just move right across into that world. I have 2 books to recommend. I'll hold up this one first. This book, I don't know if you all have read it. If you haven't read it, you really must. It's called Transitioning in Grace. It was written by a longtime Ananda member, Nalini Graber. It's, I think, 20 stories of individuals who were all meditators, or in one or two cases, their caregiver was someone who was a meditator, and how that expanded practice affected their dying. It's an absolutely magnificent book. I can't recommend it highly enough. You just keep reading it, and the stories are so enlightening. There's been so much written about how yoga and meditation benefits life, but this is one of the first books about how it changes death. The other books that have been written have been about great masters and saints who died, but this is a book about ordinary people just like you and me, except that they meditated. But one of the stories in here is for a woman who was part of our congregation. Her name was Linda Gerber. She was part of our congregation, and she had cancer, and eventually she passed away. And about a month before she died, Swami Kriyananda went over to see her. And the interview with him is in that book. And he said to her, you know, because you are such a loving person and love beauty so much, he said, you'll go to a very beautiful astral world. You'll be with saints and angels, and you'll be able to express all the beauty which she always tried to express. Her beautiful home, single-handedly she would decorate our whole church for Christmas for many years. And she just loved to create beauty. But he said to her, he says, you're going to like it too much in the astral world, he said, keep your mind on God. Don't just begin to enjoy. You know, for her enjoyment was making things beautiful, and that too can become a limiting condition. So it's very, so now let me just pull these pieces together. Let me think about it for a minute. So then if we understand that all of life and all of our incarnations is just this process of gradually overcoming the three delusions and recognizing that all life is a matter of consciousness and all issues of consciousness can only be resolved on that level, what happens to us when we die is that we just, as this is Swami saying, we just shift our consciousness to another realm. But the great mystery, and I can contemplate it as much as anyone else without having an answer, is why there's such a strong separation for almost everyone from being on this side and being on that side. I mean, the people I've known now, dear friends who have died, I often sometimes think, where are you? When I was in Israel, I had a jacket with me that had belonged to Tushti. Tushti was a woman who lived here for a while. She started the yoga center, moved to India, and then became ill. And I was with her in Portland, not at her moment of death, but for several weeks before. But I know she's somewhere, and I was wearing her jacket. I think, no, excuse me, someone else was wearing her jacket, but I saw it every day. I was thinking, where are you? What are you doing? Where are you now? When Paula died, whose story is also in here and is also in one of my books, I said to Swamiji afterwards, she was a very elevated soul, I said, sir, I feel like she's helping me all the time. Is she conscious of us? Swami's response, oh yes. Just like that, of course she is. Because unlike my mother, her consciousness was expanded, and so she could be aware. She was still helping. Because, how Swami put it, who you are continues. If you're a person who wants to help others, you just go on and help others. If you're a person who's selfish, then you just get to sit there and be selfish. Except, as Swami put it, the physical body dulls our experience a little bit. So when we're out of the physical body and are just in our energy body, which is what we are in the astral world, everything is more intense. So the negative is also more intense. Now that doesn't mean that's where the idea of hell comes from. But it's not hell that's out there that you're transported to. It's that whatever your consciousness has been, you have it. Because nothing happens when you die. However, one can see that, let's see, and this is sort of the way Ellen asked the question. It's like, how do you prepare to die? And to my mind, the way you prepare to die is the way you live every day. Because you can't cheat. When I was first starting on the path, when I was 18 and 19, I was actually, I was living in this area. I was living in Los Altos. And we had a little circle of friends who were, all of us were avidly interested in the spiritual path. And there was this one man who's been very faithful on the spiritual path all the way through, and it got more serious than this, but he read somewhere that the last sense to go away is hearing, and that you should chant Om in the ear of a dying person, or we often play Swamiji chanting Om when somebody is close to transition. And so he had this idea that he would put on headphones and he would listen to the Om, and then no matter what else he'd been doing in his life, he could live any way he wanted to, because at the end he would listen to the Om. This was the idea of it. Of course, you can't cheat, because it happens on the level of consciousness. So the question is, it's not just a question of, how will I die? Because you will die as you lived, period. Because whatever the dominant energy is, when everything gets stripped away, that's what you're left with, isn't it? So there's no waiting until the time of death. It's like, what did I do this morning? What did I do today? How much unfinished business am I carrying? How many resentments am I still holding? How many angers? How many attachments? I asked Swamiji a question once about reincarnation, and he said, what causes us to reincarnate is longing and regret. Longing for something that we never got, or that we didn't get in the way that we wanted, and regret for all those things all those mistakes that we made, or that didn't happen in the right way. And what happens when we die is all the unfinished karma just starts playing out in front of us. And we have the opportunity during the dying process to winnow it away, to make decisions. But we can't become someone that is completely other than who we've been. I mean, there's power in the dying process. I've seen it. There's transforming power. Just like there always is when you're really up against the deadline. Sometimes you put out the energy that you wouldn't put out. I read about a well-known writer who said, if it wasn't for my writing deadlines, I would never get my housework done. Meaning procrastinate. Another writer said, the problem with writing, as soon as I sit down to do my assignment, somewhere in the house, a piece of chocolate starts calling my name. So that's what will happen. A piece of chocolate will start calling our name. My friend Paula, who eventually died relatively young of cancer after 2 or 3 rounds of it, had a near-death experience earlier where Paula was a very intuitive person. She was not systematic. For a number of years, she and Latika, some of you know her, ran a gift and clothing store in Nevada City near Ananda Village. And Paula did all the buying. She was magnificent. She just knew what people would want. She intuitively knew what quantities to buy. And Latika was a businesswoman. So they would go to these gift shows together, and Paula would just wander through and buy 10 of this and 7 of that and 16 of this one and 12 of this. And then Latika would come behind her and do all the business. And together they ran a magnificent store. And Paula was on one of those buying trips, and I think she was in San Francisco. And she had a cough, and her cough was bad enough that she had a bottle of codeine cough syrup. And in her rather casual way, she would just sip it every once in a while. So she's alone in her hotel room, and she suddenly realizes she has OD'd on this narcotic. But she's OD'd to such an extent that she actually really realizes that she's dying, and she's not capable even of going and using the telephone. So she's a yogi. She's not happy about this, but here she is, she thinks she's dying. And she somehow gets the idea that if she gets into the bathroom and puts water on her face, so she's more or less on the floor, she gets to the bathtub, she turns on the bathtub water and puts water on her face. Paula also herself dressed beautifully and absolutely loved clothes. Like all the women in the community got clothes and shoes and jewelry after she died. She had just closets full of beautiful things. So she's there, and she's actually now, this is how she describes it, the toilet lid is up. She's leaning on the seat of the toilet, and she's staring into the toilet bowl. And she begins to go out. She just knows she's going down the tunnel of light. She knows she's dying. First she says, am I going to die looking into a toilet bowl? You know, it's like, this is about as terrible as you can imagine. But here she is, and she is dying, and she sees it. So she starts going through the tunnel of light and just figures, well, if that's what's happening, I'm happening. She's whizzing through the tunnel. She remembers that this really cute outfit she saw, she put it on layaway. You know, at the store, she'd reserved it, and she was supposed to go back the next day and buy it. As soon as she thought of the dress, she came right out of the light. Just came right out of it like that. She said it was a couple of more hours before she was actually certain that she wasn't going to die. So I asked her the question later. I said, did you go buy the outfit? Now, in my mind, it had saved her life. I would think that you might just go buy it and wear it every day. She says, absolutely not. Because from her side, it was, I was going into the light, and of all things, I thought about an outfit that I was going to buy. But that's not an untrue experience. Wherever your heart is, that's where your thoughts will go. Be it your children, your parents, your unfulfilled dreams, your hatreds. Anger and hatred draw people together over and over and over and over and over and over again. You know what you're angry about. Think about it. Think about it when you meditate. What disturbs your meditation? I realized at a certain point that a purpose of my meditation a lot of times was to show me where my consciousness was. Because sometimes quite surprising things would disturb my meditation. And I would realize that I have a twist in my consciousness. And if I don't work it out now, when I die, it will direct where I go next. And there won't be any way to distract myself away from it or put on headphones and listen to the Om. You know, I'll just come out of the light because I'm still mad at my neighbor, mad at my ex-husband, disappointed about my child, desperately worried about my daughter, whatever it might be. So how do you prepare for death? The same way you live. What is disturbing my peace of mind? What is distracting me from my highest ideals? Now, don't imagine that means that you shouldn't love your children or your parents or everybody in your life or your pets or anything like that. It's not like you close your heart, because closing your heart is not the solution either. It's trusting that whatever God has given me to do, I will do it as long as He wants me to do it. But it's not my plan, it's His. That is the really, really super tricky part of it. It's not my plan, it's His plan. Mother Teresa of Calcutta gave us a marvelous example of that when she was asked about how effective she thought she was in dealing with the homelessness and the dying people in Calcutta, and weren't other charities more effective than just her little handful of nuns. And she said, she was very blunt, I'm not helping the poor. She said, I'm doing what Jesus asked me to do. A very interesting answer. And so that's really what she was doing. And the implication of that is, if Jesus asked her to go minister to the rich, she would go minister to the rich. If Jesus asked her to go live in a cave, she'd go live in a cave, because that's what she was really doing. So when we have all of our attachments, which can't be broken, I mean, it's a crazy theory to imagine that we can just say, oh, I'm not attached to my son. And of course we're attached to our son. Why would we not be? You know, of course you're attached to your young child who needs you to raise, or your grandchild whose parents are not able to take care of him as you are. Of course you're attached to it. But are you taking care of your son, or are you doing the assignment that God has given you? And if it's the assignment that God has given you, then He's in charge, isn't He? And that's the practice, because when we begin to die, it's just completely outside of our hands. And this is the question that was asked about medication, which I think is an important one. From having been involved in a number of literal moments of passage in people's lives, I've come to really appreciate that the ego is so not in charge. Nobody's ego is in charge. It's not the domineering relatives, it's not the insensitive doctor, it's not the person who's dying himself or herself. The ego is not in charge. The soul has a trajectory, and the soul is going to follow that trajectory. So people agonize over all these decisions, and I've become almost cavalier about it. Just make any decision you want. You're really not going to be able to change the destiny of the person that you're working with. And if you have the impression that you have changed the destiny, well, maybe God used you as an instrument, but it was the destiny that was expressing itself, and you just do the best you can. There's much to be said in terms of medication, just speaking specifically. There's much to be said for having a clear mind and being able to relate without that confusion. But there's also much to be said for easing the pain. A hospice nurse, when Tushti was dying, she remained in her body much longer than most people expected, including the hospice nurse. Tushti lived about 2 weeks longer, or maybe even 3 weeks longer than the hospice nurse thought. She was just certain that she was going to die by the end of the weekend, and it was, I think, at least 2 more weeks. She proposed, the hospice nurse had a very interesting theory, which is, since you're all working with meditation, which is that as a meditator, Tushti was more comfortable with out-of-body states than most people were, because multiple times she went, at least it seemed to us, because we were all meditating with her, she seemed to go very, very far away from her body. And her body she would be reduced to this tiny little pulse right here, which is like the life force is drawn way up the body. We're all the way to here, heading for here. And just the tiniest little pulse, very small. And then every so often, a little breath like that. And we were just sure that, this is it. She's on her way out. And we were all, and the meditations were extraordinarily deep and expanded. And then she'd take this huge yogic breath right from the diaphragm, just breathe in completely, and then she was back. She did that maybe 3 or 4 times. Toward the end, she didn't really come into full outward consciousness. At the beginning, she did. But then we had the question, because she had pancreatic cancer, and I guess there could have been a lot of pain involved. So we had the question of giving her strong morphine, or whatever it is that they give, which is very serious, because once you start, you have to keep giving it. And the hospice nurse said that she'd seen people who were unable to die because of the pain, because the pain kept them trapped in their bodies, which I thought was a very interesting perspective. And she said, if you can dull the pain, then in actual fact it frees their consciousness. Now see, because all you're dulling is the brain, you can't possibly dull the soul, or you can't dull the spirit. So you're not really anesthetizing their consciousness, you're just anesthetizing their body. And I've certainly seen the relief on the face of someone who's dying when they finally get the medication. Even Paula, who died extremely consciously, totally conscious, she was also taking strong medication against the pain. And when I was with her, one of the nurses said, we were with Paula in her she died in the hospital, but they kind of turned the hospital over to us. There was about 25 of us with her for about 3 days. At one point, the nurse expressed concern because she hadn't urinated in quite some time. And the nurse asked me to speak to Paula. We were all family by this point. I said, Paula, the nurse is concerned. And Paula hadn't left the couch, the bed, for many hours. And she said, I hope to die before I have to pee again. That's what Paul said. I said, it's that painful. And she said, yes, like that. And she did die before she had to pee again, you know. And when it became time for that pain medication to come in, Paula was really aware. You know, she was really aware, and she would watch the clock. She knew. She never spoke of it. But it was very interesting to me how keen she was to have that come to her. And other people who've been through experiences like this, what you're watching is rarely what they're doing. You know, unfortunately, most of the time, by the time they get that far, they can't come back and tell you. But their consciousness is over here, and their body's just doing this, whether they're floating on the ceiling watching it. So I've observed, or I've made the decision that trying to control the process according to some preconceived idea is not a very good one. I mean, one should use one's intelligence and use one's intuition, but nonetheless, the oddest one that I ever had in that experience was a man who was very strong, athletic, you know, physical man, but he had this sort of backache. And he went into just to get it checked out, and discovered that he had stage 4 cancer all through his bones. I mean, it was his 5-mile run every day where his back began to ache that caused him to find it. And then he had a couple of things, and he was not on this path. In fact, he was a very, very dedicated sensualist, openly. He was wealthy, he loved his money, but the way he died showed you what his consciousness really was, because he died 2 weeks after he checked into the hospital. And he was just totally like, as he put it, it's been a great run and now it's over, just like that, just let it go. I was involved because his wife was with us. Something happened and he ended up on a respirator, I'm not quite sure how. And then they all decided that he was not capable of participating because he wasn't conscious. But they all decided that they would turn off the life support. So they asked me to come when they turned off the life support. So at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon was going to be when his life would end, which was, you know, it's an odd thing because usually you don't know. So I get there, and now his wife is totally freaked out. She's very emotional, and she's quite nervous. Everybody is quite nervous. The nurses, the doctors, everybody is nervous. This man who had been unconscious is now fully awake. You know, eyes wide open. He can't talk because he has this respirator in, but he was totally present. So we're all sitting there, you know, it's 10 of 3, and we know at 3 o'clock the life support. I mean, it was quite a scene. And he was very relaxed. I mean, maybe I'm projecting, but I don't think so. He was just the same. He was just, it's been a good run, and now it's over. But they wanted to sedate him. And I tried to say, he's fine. He doesn't need to be sedated. He's fine. But I suddenly realized that the nurses and the doctors couldn't handle it. They just couldn't handle it. I was the only person in the room he and I were the only people in the room who weren't terrified about what was about to happen. So they sedated him. He went to sleep. They removed the thing, and, you know, in a matter of minutes, he'd passed away. But I also learned something from that, which I've learned in other circumstances. What we have to give, and I'll say what we have to give when anyone is dying is not to be afraid. And you don't have to persuade them to take medication or not, or take life support or not, or anything. You just have to be in the room and not be terrified. And just feel like, oh, we're dying. And, you know, the dying person often, by this point, also is at the point of, yeah, we're dying. Like this, not always. And it's like when they have anybody in the room who just is with them in that, it's like a comfort beyond anything you can imagine. So that's the first thing that we bring to it. And everything else is details, because their soul will take over. And you're not in charge, and nobody's in charge at that point, except God and the devotee, the person, whoever they are. Well, let's take a break, okay? And then we'll come back and see what's left. Okay, are we? I wanted to take the opportunity to speak also of another book about death, which is even less which is somewhat less well known. Many of you know Savitri at Ananda Village, Nayaswami Savitri. She's written 3 fiction books that are a trilogy. And the third one is called Through the Gates of Death and Beyond, Adventures in the Lokas of Immortality, the Treta Yuga Trilogy. There you have it. I don't know if we have the book in the boutique. What I did is I just Xeroxed off of Amazon. This is a really wonderful book. What she did was she took these characters that she's had through this trilogy, which are people living in higher ages than this one. And she has, you know, the plot is that one of these wise women, older woman and her granddaughter, that the older woman is given the assignment by the council to sort of do this big study about death for their university of learning, you know. So, and then she takes her granddaughter with her. But it's beautifully written, and what she has done is she has incorporated all of Master's teachings about death, even a lot of Master's own words. You know, she manages to make it part of the story, and the story is charming, the characters are delightful, the vibration is absolutely wonderful, and at the end of it, you've gone on this huge journey about death and dying. So it's both of these together. I mean, these are like really revolutionary books, because this is really death from a self-realization point of view. So I printed up a number of these just out of Amazon, because that's we could have it in our boutique. We might even have it in our boutique. I didn't look, but you can also just order it online. Okay, there you are.
Could you please repeat the name?
It's called Through the Gates of Death and Beyond. That's really the name of it, and the author is Nayaswami Savitri Simpson. Okay? And she and I were exchanging emails. We were laughing. I told her that Swami said nothing happens when you die. And she said, huh? She said, I just wrote a whole big book as if something actually does happen when you die. She always has a great sense of humor. So there we are. All right. I was asked a couple of things came up during the break, but before I do that, does anyone have questions or comments or something that needs to be said before we go forward from the first hour? Let's pass the microphone. Can someone find it? Thank you. Jan?
So you talked about destiny and how our minds can't really get in the way of that.
Right.
So does that play out in unexpected death as well? Is it not maybe as unexpected as it seems to be?
Well, unexpected by whom is the question. I'll tell you, here's a really interesting story. This is the story of Sita Reed, Sita and Ramurti. I mean, Sita, I hope I get this correct, but this is how I understood it. She, when she was 10 years old, her mother had twin boys. And so she had these 2 younger brothers. And the boys, the men, took kind of a different life path than Sita did. And one of her brothers died unexpectedly in a motorcycle accident in which he was killed instantly. And neither of the brothers had any particular interest in spiritual life or anything like that. So she had to go back to Illinois or wherever they're from, Indiana, for the funeral. And later, one of her brother's friends told this story, and he was so freaked out by it, it took him a week or 2 before he was able to say it, because they were all riding motorcycles together, and they were just going down some road like this, and her brother pulled up next to this friend, riding his motorcycle like this, and her brother, who had no interest in spiritual life or of anything like this, he looks over to his friend and shouts across the distance, "When I'm in heaven, I'll pray for you." And then he pulls out like this, and within a minute, he was in a head-on collision and he died. So like, what do we know and what do we not know? It's just, and the friend was so shattered by the whole experience, he couldn't even articulate this for a long time. There's a story of Edgar Cayce, which is well known, Edgar Cayce was a psychic, and he was in an ordinary building, and an elevator came. He was on an upper floor, and an elevator came, and the doors opened, and he needed to go down. Edgar needed to go down, but for some reason he just couldn't get in the elevator, and he stayed there, and the doors closed, the cable broke, the elevator fell, everyone was killed. And later, Edgar Cayce realized, because he was both a saint and a psychic, and he realized that no one in the elevator had an aura. That normally he would see the light field around everyone, but the elevator doors open. No one had an aura, and it was just so shocking to him. He didn't cognize what he was looking at, but what he was looking at was so strange that it pushed him back, and so he didn't get in the elevator. But their souls had already withdrawn. Master said, when you're in a violent collision or something like that, he said, usually or always, the soul just pulls out of the body before it happens, because why would I hang around for this? And people who have death and return often speak of that. Just before the two cars collided, I was up above watching it. Why would I be in my body when I knew that was going to happen? So a great deal of difficulty in every dimension of our society right now is that we are atheistic. And we believe, we are so materialistic as a society, we just don't think that there's anything going on beyond the obvious physical and mental dimension. And so therefore, a great deal makes no sense. And we try desperately to control everything ourselves. This was the question that was also asked. I haven't answered your question completely, Jen, so let me come back to it. But Dannion Brinkley, who has done a lot with end of life, because he had out-of-body experiences that changed his perspective, a death and return experience. He described our obsession now with what he called greed for life. He said we've become so greedy as a society, as a culture, that it extends to this greed for life. And he put out these statistics, which I've heard verified from other places, that the entire crisis in the cost of healthcare, collectively, he said 70 cents of every medical dollar is spent in the last 6 months of life to extend life an average of 21 days. And he said, and those 21 days are likely to be the most awful you ever live through. Because we just cannot accept that we just want a little more, a little more, a little more. We don't have any respect. We don't have any respect for the possibility of soul wisdom. We just keep running everything from the preferences of the ego. Swami Kriyananda talked about his own father who had a heart attack. And his father lived a good life. He wasn't a spiritual man, but he was a very honorable man. He was very happy with his life. He had a heart attack when he was feeling very well, and then he had a heart attack. But they managed to rush him to the hospital and keep him alive for 12 more months. And they were a miserable 12 months. He couldn't taste anything. He could hardly hear. He began to lose his sight. When he fell, they had to call the fire department to get him to come. It was just awful. He said if he'd just been allowed to die when he had a heart attack, it just would have been so much, easier for him. Now, you have to put the other side of it. There's karma that has to be worked out. But collectively, we just have this idea that we need to keep people alive because we can keep people alive, even when they themselves are trying to get out of their bodies. They're trying to leave. We were discussing, Saranya and I were talking about with Alzheimer's and things like that, there'll come a point where the person will no longer cognize food as food. This was one of my wonderful moments with my dad after my mother had passed and my father was being cared for because he couldn't take care of himself. He was in a facility. And one of the caregivers called and said, once I identified myself, "It's all right, we called poison control and there's no problem." I said, "And what are we talking about?" So here's what had happened. My father had been sitting at the dinner table and there was a bowl of flowers on the table, and there was a bowl on the table, so he just started eating the flowers, you know, because he just couldn't tell the difference. So he ate more than one flower before, and it wasn't nasturtiums or something that you would normally eat. So they had called poison control to make sure that he was okay. I thought it was hysterically funny. So when I began to laugh, she began to laugh too, because, you know, the staff thinks these things are very funny too, because they go through it. Now, my father was still eating, but he didn't know, and he couldn't taste the difference and so on like that. But there was a point where they called us and they said, he doesn't want to get out of bed and he doesn't want to eat or drink. I said, leave him be. And my sister and brother and I just went and sat with him for 3 days, and then he slipped away. And when he died, oh my gosh, I felt so much joy when he died. I mean, it was really extraordinary. I think he saw my mom, but just whew, right up the spine. And then, this is about grief. All the people in the facility. He was very popular, because when he lost his mental acuity, he kind of just became extremely sweet. He forgot what he used to worry about, and we were very fortunate. And so he was very popular. And so the staff was, and also I think the staff felt they needed to be sad because they expected us to be sad. None of the three of us really were, but I was just so happy. Finally, my sister, she punches me in the ribs like this and says, you know, you've got to stop smiling, she said. I said, I can't. She said, well, then go over there. Because, you know, we had to deal appropriately with these people, because some of them were even in tears. And I was just laughing, and because I felt him. And he was just so happy. And I was just, you know, but we could have done all kinds of things at that point. You know, we could have, God knows, we could have dragged him up, we could have tried to feed him. Now, of course, he was in his 80s, and his life was done. But we still do that. One of my friends was telling me that, her mother died in the afternoon, and in the morning they took chest x-rays. She said now she would have stopped them. But it's just like we keep trying to keep people alive. Why? You know, we don't die, we just transition. Why? Because we can't let them go. Often, or there's other reasons. Yes, dear. What's your question, Crystal?
I sometimes have done home health care, and I had a neighbor who, her daughter was in a very bad car accident, and she was crushed in the car, and she was in a coma for 6 months, and they put her on life support. And then the mother and the father of this girl, she was an adopted child as well. She was 19, so they were at odds with each other about whether to keep her on the life support. The mother wanted to keep her on the life support. The father said no. She had a brainstem injury. So they got divorced. The mother decided to keep her on the life support. She's my age, I'm 45. She's still living. She can't walk or eat or talk or do anything. Like, she just has to be taken out of her bed by a lift, brought into the shower. She eats through a tube in her stomach, and the mother said that the doctor really encouraged her to, like, let her go, and she just couldn't let her go. And she told me this story, and then she showed me this photo album of, like, her in her bed after the accident and all this stuff. And it's like this, I feel sad, you know, about that this woman has been in a bed for, like, you know, 25 years. But it's really interesting going to the home where she lives. She lives in Scotts Valley in a home with other people who've been in bad car accidents with brain injuries and things like that. And, like, what the situation is facilitating for the people who take care of the people in the home, as far as, like, spiritually, like the mom, the adoptive mom, her whole life revolves around God at this point, whereas it didn't at the time of the car accident. And it's just interesting, but I have a lot of spiritual experiences and intuitive things and psychic stuff happen to me. And what I see about the person living in the body is it's not the person who died in the car accident. Like, the person who died in the car accident, it looks like it's not her. And there's this sort of energy there, like someone is in there, but it doesn't really have the vibration of the person that was there before to me. And I don't know if it's just something shifted energetically, or if it's a totally different spirit. And I wondered if you have any idea if that's possible.
Well, okay. First of all, one incarnation seems really enormous when you're living it, you know? But if we could see it from the astral world and realize that we haven't had merely hundreds, we've had millions of incarnations. An incarnation of 60 or 70 years or 45 years seems like an incredible long time when you're living it. But it's not at all long compared to eternity, period. All time, when I asked Swami the question, Master said he remembers back to the individuality of being a diamond, that individualized consciousness begins with gemstones. And Master, the man who became the jiva, the individualized unit of spirit that became Paramhansa Yogananda, remembers being a diamond. Someone asked me the question, how long does it take? You know, how long are you a diamond? Then I began to ask questions like, do you then become a ruby, an emerald, you know? Like, what do you become after you're a diamond? Just all these questions, curiosity questions. I had no idea what the answer was, and Swami Kriyananda was still living. So he was, of course, the only person I could think of who might have an answer. So I had the opportunity, and I told him this question, and I asked him, and he said, that's a really dumb question. And by this was toward the end of his life, by which point I was quite comfortable, and I said, I thought it was a real interesting question, Swamiji. I was really curious. And then he just kind of like, I'm not going to deign to answer such a dumb question. And dumb because what are you going to do with that information? That's what he meant. It's like, how is it going to help you to know how long it takes to be a diamond? That was what he was responding to. Not that intellectual curiosity is useless, but he knew it was kind of a, who knows. But then, as often happens when he sort of rejects something, then God gives him a response. So just a few seconds later, he said, all time is short compared to eternity. So what are you going to say? It took 100 million years.
Like 25 years of suffering in one body.
And you're not even certain that she's suffering, because she may be paying back a karmic debt. Maybe she has, I mean, I'm just going to run possible scenarios. Maybe she had an absolute aversion to being helpless and needed to understand what it is to be helpless. Maybe she's inflicted great suffering on someone else and has a huge debt that she has to pay. Maybe she has a contract with her mother, that her mother needed this experience, and so she's helping her mother. Maybe her mother needed the necessity to be absolutely dedicated to serve. It doesn't even have to be personal between them. It can be just, I mean, you could list all kinds of scenarios that could say it was okay. And then you can make a whole bunch of other scenarios that say, oh, this was not such a great plan. It would have been easier. But either one of them, it doesn't make a lot of difference, because people are just going to act out what they need to learn, and it is not possible for there to be an error, in the sense that everything leads to God realization. And whether it leads directly and quickly in the most efficient, in the freest way, or whether it's a long, circuitous, let's tie a knot and then untie it way, everything leads to God realization. And so this question about, quote, unexpected death is unexpected when we think that the world is run by my ego preferences. The ego prefers ease, comfort, and everybody to stay in order according to my ideas. And bad is when that doesn't happen. The soul wants God realization.
So like maybe even if she's experiencing suffering.
Yeah.
Just making sense of what you're saying.
Yeah, even if she's experiencing
so that even
suffering.
if she's this woman who's,
suffering.
Yeah, I don't know what to call it, but she can't, do anything at this point in her life. An invalid. And even if she is experiencing that as suffering in the physical body or in the reality of that, that it is, on a soul level, it's freeing her.
It's freeing her.
Right? She's moving towards God.
She has to be.
In that, what looks like on a physical level, sort of arrested.
Right. We really don't know. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't exercise our common sense and do our best, that we shouldn't examine our motives, that we shouldn't talk about whether we're really helping the other person or whether we're just afraid for ourselves. I mean, there's 1,000 good questions to ask, but when you look at it from the outside, it cannot be wrong.
Like in the very big picture, it really...
In the very big picture, it must happen the way it has to happen. But because we are so materialistic in our society and we do not have an established, intelligent, dynamic relationship with a greater reality than ourselves, we have no context for understanding these stories. We don't understand karma, we don't understand reincarnation, and we don't understand the process of self-realization. I don't mean we in this room, but we as a culture, but we as a person, because these are big, challenging things. I mean, you're looking at it as someone you know, but it could easily be you. You know, when we were in Assisi, when I was with Swami on the road outside of town where our center is located in Assisi, Italy, at that time on the side of the road there was this shrine, as there often is on the roadside where somebody died. So there's this little shrine there, and we were there, I was there visiting him for some time, and there was always fresh flowers in that shrine. So Swamiji asked, he'd been away, and he asked one of the residents there, "What is this?" "Oh, this woman's son died in a motorcycle accident." Actually, I think it had been like a year or 2 years, and there was fresh flowers in that shrine every day. And Swami's answer was, "Oh, that poor man." Not the poor woman, it was the poor man. His mother grieving all this time, it must be a terrible burden on his consciousness. You know, he said that she's not helping him. She's just holding, he's done with that form. I mean, mother-son is a physical relationship. It may also be a higher soul relationship, but the definition of mother and son has to do with your physical bodies. The physical body dies, it's over. And she's desperately holding on to that. And what Swami said was also interesting. He's going to be forced to repudiate her completely. That's how he put it. Because otherwise he won't be able to get free of that clinging attachment. You know, on another level, he'll just have to push her out of his consciousness, which is the last thing she would want. Speaking of grief, because that question was also asked, it's natural to miss someone you love. How could you not? You know, we're here, God gives us these great gifts, and then if it breaks, if it's taken away from us, grief is a perfectly natural part of things, and it's a mistaken application of spiritual principles to imagine that we won't grieve or to think we shouldn't grieve. The hardest thing to really comprehend is how the masters, how Swami put it, infinite consciousness implies that you're also aware of the infinitesimal. And so what the masters do is they inhabit the entire spectrum. But what we tend to do is we inhabit the lower octave of the spectrum. They inhabit the entire spectrum, but that doesn't mean they're not also participating all the way to the infinitesimal, but they do it with a context. Master, when Sister Gyanamata died, who was his most advanced woman disciple, he said he kept her in her body for 20 years for the benefit of the tapasya she did. She was unwell. Her tapasya was a great benefit to his spiritual work and to many disciples. That's a whole other subtle point. And finally, he gave her permission to leave her body in essence. He said he watched her merge into the infinite light. She was completely free. He wept at her funeral. You know, and he wept because, you know, Sister is gone. Sister and I will never be together in this form again. They'd had this beautiful friendship, this beautiful partnership in serving God together. She was he said, I looked at her life and there was not one, did he use the word sin? But there was no, you know, she was perfect. and he wept. And you would think, why would he weep? But because he also had a human heart. And so it's just natural for us to weep. I read an aphorism somewhere, I have no idea who said it, that grief is love with no place to put it. Which actually, I thought that was very, very helpful, because then I thought, oh, well, let me put it somewhere. If I can put that love somewhere, then that will help with the grief. Because part of the grief is the belief that once I've lost this form, no other form is possible. Robin has can someone pass the microphone? And you know, that's what causes us. But that doesn't mean you can't miss. It's natural to miss. Yes, Robin?
Well, I feel there's a huge difference between attachment and love.
Yes, of course.
And when we're loving someone, we can be in that unconditional place of holding them in that love. And I think a lot of grief is the attachment is still active.
Yes, of course.
And it's pulling on us, and there can be actual physical pain because of that.
Absolutely.
And then also I feel like that sometimes people don't, when people are of a certain consciousness, they don't know how to let go. I witnessed my father die about 5-6 years ago, and he was just so frustrated. He was a self-made man. He, was a doctor. He had a private practice. He did things in the world, made a difference. And I remember him sitting on the bed in his shorts going, "This is such a conundrum," because he didn't know how to let go.
Right.
And when I sat there with him, I said, "Pop, I think it's not so much something you do, it's something that you surrender to."
Right.
And he looked at me and he goes, "Oh, okay." And the next day he was gone. So
sometimes that moment is just there where you can just say just the right thing.
Yeah.
Everything is lined up, and all somebody needs is another point of view.
Yeah.
Exactly perfect. Yeah. Yes, of course, grief and love and attachment get all mixed up together. But it's hard not to be attached. and it's not always it's what we used to call, jokingly, we used to call true but irrelevant. Someone said, you shouldn't be attached. Oh, sure, and I shouldn't have 2 hands, and I shouldn't have hair on my head. What am I supposed to do with that? Of course we're attached, but that's where we have to become more deeply attached to the fact of the truth of God's will and the truth of karma. And these are not things, sometimes you do learn them in the intensity of grief, but it's better if you've practiced before that comes. And you just will be sad. If something really beautiful isn't there anymore, you'll be sad about it. But it's not so much, this is how I think about it, if there's a black spot in your life, and the black spot is right here over your eyes, then everything is black. But if you can get a perspective, and so that black spot exists in a bigger field, it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed. It exists now in a bigger field. That's why grief is love with no place to put it. If all you're thinking about is I can't, I don't have, I lack. But if you put it here and you find other places to put your love, this is still a hole, and it will remain a hole for the rest of your life, because it was so lovely and now it's not there anymore. And it's the memory of something marvelous. However, you don't serve that person by continuing to grieve, because they need to go on. I've often put it like this: if you raise a daughter and she goes to live in Europe, you want her to go have her life. And if you call her every day and talk about how much you miss her and how miserable your life is without her, is that really loving her? Who are you loving then? So if someone dies, whether at the age of 4 or the age of 94, their soul has another journey. And if I spend all my time telling them, no, you mustn't, I'm so miserable, how is that loving them? A woman friend of mine whose father had worked, well, she was an acquaintance, You know, her father had worked very hard to take care of her and her siblings, and really worked very hard, had a very good life, had a victorious life. He died at an appropriate age. Several years later, she's still in mourning. Finally, I became impatient. I said, for heaven's sakes, give the man a break. Like, you know, he gave so much to you. Just let him go on. Why are you still insisting that he relate to you? And that's it. This isn't love. This isn't about that person. This is about you. And this is where grief is the problem of consciousness. And so I don't think we should repudiate it, because I don't think that's sincere. But we have to we have to ask ourselves, what am I really grieving? What am I really upset about? I've had times in my life where I've been upset with some apparent cause, and then gradually I realize I don't even know what I'm grieving for. I don't even know what incarnation I'm grieving for. It's that what this immediate experience has opened a doorway to a kind of geological strata, which is misery. And this has just given me an excuse, but the misery is way out of proportion to the event. We have to be authentic. We have to be really honest and sincere with ourselves, otherwise we accomplish nothing. I'll give you the story of Ramakrishna, and then Doug, you can have your turn. The story of Ramakrishna, he had a nephew who took care of him, and just really was his personal attendant, took care of him for years. Then the nephew died. And Ramakrishna was weeping like a child. Who will take care of me? Who will bring me my tea in the morning? Who will walk by the river with me? And then he would turn like this, and he would be dancing in ecstasy and talking about watching his soul ascend into the infinite and all the karma, the good karma this man got, and all the bliss that he was now experiencing. Then he would turn and then he would weep again. Who will bring me my tea in the morning? Who will walk by the Ganges? And he just went. Both are true. One was not more or less true than the other. This is just the whole spectrum of life. And what a lot of times grief is anger at reality. And whenever we rebel against reality, we always lose. And so we have to ask ourselves, how am I going to solve the problem of consciousness? You see, it all comes back to that. Doug?
I wanted to share a resource, which is the Grief Recovery Handbook. It's a very orderly way to work your way through the reality of grief. It's by two men, John James and Russell Friedman. And it doesn't go into anything beyond the reality of the grief itself. It's not trying to take us to a more esoteric or higher level of awareness about what's happened, only to deal with the reality of the grief itself. Highly effective.
Very good.
Excuse me, highly effective.
Very good. That's very, I mean, today, because there's so much enlightened energy toward these things, there's a lot that you can work with. Now, Jen, you had asked the question at the beginning about grief. Is there more? Do you have more questions on that, or is this sufficient? Here's the.
I guess the only other aspect that hasn't been addressed is how to help other people who may not have the conscious understanding. And I guess specifically, we're in the meditation teacher training, so using that.
My experience of all counseling and everything, whether the subject is death or not, is not to be afraid. A lot of people are afraid of other people's suffering and feel the necessity to try to alleviate it because it makes me uncomfortable that you're suffering. In the progression of the soul through the various castes, which I don't know if you've come into that yet or not, it's in the Raja Yoga course too. The second of the four castes, and these are castes based on your level of consciousness, not on your position in society. The second caste is when my happiness depends on my controlling my external world. And you transcend that to my happiness depends on my solving the problems of consciousness by controlling my own responses to the external world. So a lot of times, a lot of social service and altruism to try to make the world a better place, some of it comes from true idealism, which is the third caste, where I'm operating from principle. There are hungry people in the world. I have more than I need. I'm going to act to help other people. It's a principle that I'm following. Others act from, I am so frightened that you're hungry, I must make you not be hungry. I'm so frightened that you're grieving, I must make you stop grieving. I'm so frightened that you're angry at your mother, I must make you stop being angry at your mother. So a lot of times, our counseling actually comes from anxiety. And that is that's one of the reasons we all do this kind of work, is because we all begin to understand ourselves by doing this kind of work. So my experience has been that, and here's a very interesting point about suffering, also whether it's death, grief, or whatever it is I learned this for like 20 years, from 1986 to about 2006, 12 times or 13 times, I was part of a group where we took Americans to India and for the most of the time, pilgrimage trips. Most of the time, the Americans we were taking had never been to India before. And starting especially in '86, when India was a very different country than it was even 20 years later. Most of the Americans we took had never been in what they now call the developing world. They'd never seen homelessness on a large scale, or people with leprosy, or just the kind of things that especially then, you would see everywhere. And it was very interesting to me how differently people responded. Some people were just completely at ease. They'd be surrounded by beggars and they would just be perfectly cheerful. Others would be absolutely freaked out. They couldn't get onto the bus fast enough. They couldn't get back into the hotel. They had to pull the shades. They just were frightened to death by it. And I began to think, why are people all responding differently? And I began to see the pattern was, one is comfortable with other people's suffering to the extent that one has realized in oneself that suffering is necessary for personal growth. And if one has realized that suffering brings personal growth, then when you see other people suffering, you're not frightened by it, because you intuitively recognize, even if you want to help them, or even if even if you weep watching them, you're not frightened by it. And fear is the great confuser. So I have found when people bring me tough situations, which, I don't do as much of this work now, but I did for decades, my ability simply to not be frightened by it. And just to realize, these things happen, don't they? This is a tough one. This is going to take a lot to get through. And just be able to just say that because I have a lot of willpower and a lot of words, I used to think that my job was to make it right for everyone. And I gradually sorted out that was because I needed to make it right for them, not because they needed me to make it right for them. I really learned this in the last years of my parents' life, because I tried to sort of take over their life and make it look like what I thought it ought to look like, which they did not appreciate at all, not even a tiny bit. And then I finally realized that this was their karma. They needed this experience, and that my job was to support them in going through it, not to try to change it and run it. And as soon as I started doing that, everything just started working really, really well. And it was things like, what if you fall? I need to make sure that you never fall. That was when my mother said to me, every time I cough, you think I'm about to die. And that was when I realized what I was doing, because it would be so inconvenient for me if she fell. Whereas if she fell, she would just fall. I had to finally accept, something really terrible could happen. But if it happens, it's okay. We'll all get through it. So, and once you're in that state, once you're not afraid, it's just obvious what to say. It's when you're afraid that you can't think of what to say, because all that fear is just, well, perfect love casts out all fear. That's what St. Paul said. And as soon as the fear is gone, then the love is present. And most of the time, I would say virtually all the time, people already know what to do. And every once in a while, like Robin's saying, you'll get to articulate for them what they already know, and they'll recognize it. And they'll say, oh, right. But they won't recognize it if you're just telling them. They'll only recognize it if it's about what they're here. So to David's question about, what to do with his father, I think just listen really carefully to everything he says and answer, live in his world and ask, okay, I'll put several things in this. It's not only that you pray to Divine Mother, tell me what to do. I've found you actually pray to the soul of the person you're trying to help. So you're sitting with your dad and you don't know what to do, and you say inwardly, Dad, what do you want me to do? What would help you at this point? And I found wonderful, unexpected responses when I asked the superconsciousness of the person I'm with. And sometimes the superconsciousness says, leave me alone. I don't want anything from you. Just, let's share a cup of tea and watch the baseball game. Because they don't want words, they don't want instruction, they don't want guidance. They just want company. And so you have to be very careful about it. And then once you get into that state, you'll find that every once in a while you can just drop something in and it'll just come to you spontaneously. But so little of communication is actually what we say. Most of communication is who we are. And that's why, once again, if you're just not afraid of anything, then it all tends to come out just as it's supposed to. I know with someone, I was trying to help an older person, and I was suggesting certain things, and they were not responding well. And I said, don't you want to keep growing? And he said to me, no, no. I've struggled enough in my life. I just want to sort of basically coast through to the end. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, what am I doing then? I'm always trying to instruct and inspire. It's like, they're not interested. Oh my, what am I doing here? My mother, who was just delightful in certain ways, she said something like, how did she put it? She said something like, other people, because she sort of knew the life I lived a little bit, something like, other people may think you're wise, but I know you better than they do. It was something real close to that. Fortunately, I didn't need anything from her, and I knew where she was coming from. And I just looked at her for a moment, and then I laughed, and I said, oh, Mom, you have no idea. So many people hang on my every word. How relaxing to be completely disregarded. And she laughed and I laughed, and we just left it at that point. And I stopped trying to teach her. She wasn't asking. It was just me. No, that's you. You have to keep your own consciousness straight, then everything else follows. Yeah. Swamiji, I observed, and I began to observe that he didn't always explain things to people, even though he could. He would often make what I called sympathetic clucking noises, where somebody says something and you just go, yeah, wow, like that. And often a great deal of communication has actually happened, because that's really all they want. They just want to be heard, they want to be seen, they want to feel understood. They don't want instruction. So you get comfortable with actually no real content, but vibrationally big content. For a verbal person like me, that was a really hard lesson. But then I began to notice that Swami, I would watch him sometimes and realize that all he'd said was, But a lot had transpired. Much more had transpired than articulating all these things that nobody wanted to hear. Who am I serving? David?
So something you said earlier brought something up that I've been thinking about for a long time. I had a very close friend of mine. We grew up together, next door neighbors, spent the night together. We were best friends. When he was about 21, he was headed to Annapolis on a motorcycle, no helmet, and that was the end of his day. He had a truck, and that was the end of his day. I think about him a lot.
He died.
He died.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think about him a lot.
Right.
But I also try not to think about him a lot because I don't want to. My question is it, how do I know if it's based from fear or from love?
Well, you know, you could be thinking about him a lot because he's still thinking about you. You know, he could be an angel helping you. He could be in the astral world. I feel that Paula helps us. I think that Tushti helps us. I feel, Paula especially, I feel Paula is still, I mean, she died, I don't know, 20 years ago, and I feel like Paula's just still hanging around. Certain difficulties I have, I pull out her picture and just ask her help. So if you and he were that close, he could just still be being your friend, just from the astral world. So the fact that he comes into your mind is not necessarily a bad thing at all. If you're constantly rebelling against his death, or grieving for him, or lamenting the tragedy of it, now that's a problem. But merely to remember him is not a problem at all, and may in fact be inspired by him, who he's just still wanting to keep you company. So you have to, by their fruits. This is the question that was asked Jesus, how can you tell a true prophet from a false one? But it's the answer to a question like, it's the answer to many questions. A good tree brings good fruit, and a bad tree brings bad fruit. So by the fruit, you can tell whether this is a good or a bad thing. Does thinking about him constantly make you sad or angry? That's not so good. If just thinking about him is just to remember what a good life you had, and even with a little sadness to think, gosh, I would have liked him to be here, we could have had a good time together, I wonder what he might have done. But you just turn it toward a helpful thought, something that, like, if he were living in Europe, he would like to get in a letter, you know, and it would make him happy to get it, or touch his heart to get it. I would think of it like that. And I think these things go through phases. I had, this was not death, but when I was, let's see, 4th grade to 8th grade, 9th grade, 8th grade, I had a very good friend. She was a bit of a wild child, and later I realized that there were some really unwholesome things going on in her home, but I was too inexperienced to realize that when I was small. But we were good friends for a number of years. But then 9th grade, we began to separate. She began to really, she took up lots of practices that were not mine. And at 15, I moved geographically. Then I get to Ananda, and I'm loving Ananda and all this, and I'm constantly thinking of this woman. Now she's alive, she's not dead. And I want her to know what I'm doing, and I dream about her often. I dreamt about her often. And in the dream, always I would say, oh, I'm so glad to see you. I've been so wanting to tell you what I'm doing, like this. And it would happen repeatedly. Finally, I was asleep, and she came to me, and she said, leave me alone. She said, I've changed. I said, that was a period of time, and I'm just not interested. I'm not able, was more. I'm not able to relate to what you're trying to get me to relate to. Leave me alone. I said, okay, and I've never dreamt it for since. So it's just like, there's mysteries here that we just don't know what they're about. Every time you think about him, say a prayer for him. You know, bless him, wish him well. And just say to Divine Mother, why do I keep thinking about him? How can I help him? Because we just don't know. And it may come to a natural fruition. I'll tell you, I had 3 dreams of my mother after she died in that period of time. The first dream, my mother was not trusting of other people. And one of the reasons I had to go to Los Angeles so often is because even small things, she insisted that I had to do them. So after she died, like soon after she died, she was kind of shriveled with the Parkinson's by the end. And so she's sitting on the edge of a bed, and I've read and been told, you know, there's astral hospitals, and especially someone who's been sick for a long time might not realize that they're not sick anymore. They might not quite realize that they're dead. And because she also left her body suddenly, so she's sitting on the edge of this bed, and she still looks old and rather shriveled, and she's beckoning me to come sit next to her. So I come and sit next to her. She kind of looks around to make sure no one is listening. Then she starts telling me that she needs me to do certain things for her. This was, you know, very typical sort of interaction. And I kind of look around, and I don't really see anybody, but I know she's in the astral hospital. And I say, Mom, you know, I think there's a lot of people here who could really help you. I don't think so, she says like this, you know, just in the same consciousness that she died in. So I said, I think you're going to be okay. I'm going to go now. And so I just walked away from her because she had to relate to that. She couldn't stay with me. So that was the first dream. The second dream was, I don't know the time span, but this would all have been in the 2 years before my father died. And I think it was all in the 6 months or so after she died. The next dream she comes, she's not sick anymore. She's strong. I think she was older, but I'm not certain. But she was strong and she was not ill at all. And she came to see my dad, who's still in the body. And so she and my dad go into their bedroom, which is of course what parents did, and they shut the door to their bedroom. And everything is great. And then after a short time, I hear her calling my name in this very plaintive way. And I open the door like this, and she's getting old and she's getting sick again like this. And I grabbed her, I pulled her away from my father, and I pushed her out of the room. I said, it's too soon, you can't come back now. And so I pushed her out of the room, and then I woke up. The third dream, my favorite picture of my parents was when they were both 24. It was their engagement photo. My mother was very beautiful, and they looked so happy. So my mother walks into my dream. She looks, that's who she is. She's 24, she's radiantly happy, and the two of us just stand and look out the window together. And then I never dreamt of her again. So it's like, these are like the sequences that you progress through. And some karmas are deeper than others and last indefinitely. And some of them just flow like that. But just watching the progression of that, thinking about your friend, thinking about the fact that when Palo was dying in the hospital, she had a kind of like a childlike way of speaking that was almost like a southern accent just because of the way she was. She calls, Swami he must have been in Italy, I think he was out of the country, so she talks to him on the phone. She says, Swamiji, I hope they have a job for me in the astral world. You know I like to stay busy. Just like that. He said, Paula, I'm sure they're ready for you. So I think she just walked right over and just kept helping. Why would she not? So if you love this man, keep helping him. Yeah, and assume that he's coming to you for a good reason.
I had this dream a couple of weeks ago that I haven't really made sense of, but after hearing everything that you're saying, I'm feeling, I haven't really shared this dream either, like I should share it. I dreamt that, I'm assuming I was in the astral world, and there were all these different categories of colors. Like over here would be this pink vortex, and over here there was a blue one, and a green one, and orange, and they were all separate. And I was swimming with my beloved, whoever that was, like in water, but we weren't in water. And we were swimming around, and all of a sudden it's like, okay, we were jumping between colors, like between worlds. And then all of a sudden, my beloved, whoever that was, jumped into this swirling vortex of blue, and the hole closed up before I could jump in behind him. So we were separated. And at first I was like, and then immediately, oh, well, that's okay. I'll just jump over here. We're going to meet up later anyway. And afterwards, when I woke up that morning, I felt so relieved.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, like not that I'm afraid to die, I just feel like it's sooner than I would have liked, given my health challenges. So I have had it on my mind that I'm going, you know. But after that dream, it wasn't about death, so to speak. It was just jumping from one world to another, and it was fun, and it was playful, and it was joyous. But then as soon as my other went off and I couldn't follow, I was scared. But then that sort of faded into the bigger picture of, well, we'll meet up down the line.
I mean, that's Divya, that's marvelous, absolutely marvelous, and so incredibly true. Dannion Brinkley, who used to do a lot of public speaking, someone said, you talk about how happy people are when they go into the astral world, and then this woman said to him with tears in her eyes, doesn't my mother miss me? I miss her so much, doesn't she miss me? It's a very honest question. And he said, and I don't know how valid his point of view was, but he said, well, from that perspective, you realize the separation lasts about this long, and he blinked like that. And so from here, it seems like a long separation. From there, it doesn't, because they live on, if it's an elevated consciousness, they're able to see the whole picture, and they realize you're doing what you need to do. And there's no reason to grieve, because you'll just go pink for a while, and then we'll just meet up, we'll merge in purple, and it'll be just, I mean, this is why the saints are joyful. This is why the whole thing ends in bliss, is this whole picture that we have of separation and loneliness, and I must have this avenue to love, or else I have no love. Grief is love without a place to put it. And that is a delusion. I mean, when you go all the way to the macro of this, where there is only one reality, we're never separated from anyone or anything, it's a delusion. But it's also just part of the strange rhythm. You know, you're saying that reminds me, this is part of the same story. Someone had a dream once about me, and I said something to them that in the dream, that they felt very helped by it. And I was talking to Swami about it afterwards. I said, so what was so interesting about it was something I really wanted to tell that person, but I never felt the opening. And so I just felt that it would have been an intrusion. But when they were sleeping and I was sleeping, it was attracted and received. I said, what is that? You know, I'm not conscious of it. His answer was fascinating. He said, superconsciousness never sleeps. It's only the brain that needs to sleep. See, this is now you have to get the difference between the physical world. Consciousness is independent of the brain. The superconsciousness doesn't need a physical vehicle. It's always vibrating. He said, so when your brain goes to sleep, your consciousness doesn't go to sleep. And whoever you are, you continue to be. So it would be perfectly reasonable that if you're trying to do something serviceful, you would take whatever opportunity was there, including the fact that both of you are asleep, so nobody's resisting, right? And you have the opportunity. Death is the same. You know, once there is this divinely imposed veil, darkness between the physical world and the non-physical world, but that doesn't mean that the contact isn't continuous and helpful and exactly the same as it was here, because death doesn't make us somebody else. It just puts us in a new set of clothes and in a new surrounding. Yeah, wonderful, wonderful lesson. Fabulous. All right. I was going to take a short break. We have only 35 minutes, but I think everybody would benefit from a few minutes of stretching. So this is just like refresh yourselves outdoors or with water, but come back relatively soon. Our 10-minute break was about 15 minutes before, so let's make this one. So, I was asked 2 questions during the break, which may take us to the end of the session today, so let's see what happens. The first question was about suicide, which is a very important question, and I always like to be very careful because a lot of people's lives have been touched by suicide, and it's by no means something that's easy to consider. Suicide is the ultimate effort to prove that the delusion of intoxication will actually bring me happiness. Because suicide is the idea that I can lower my consciousness to the point where I will obliterate it and that will make me feel better. So that's really what it is. It's that I don't want to be aware because awareness causes me pain, so I will just keep cutting down my awareness to the point where I will actually attempt to kill my awareness. And it's wrong thinking, it's a mistake. And the real problem with suicide is that it accomplishes nothing. But it's a very strong, let's see, effort, you know, in that direction. So it's a very strong commitment to a false idea. And a very strong commitment to a false idea has to be undone with the same amount of energy in order to undo it that you put into creating it. So you set yourself on a cycle that will take time to undo, because once a habit is firmly established. I've also been understood that suicide can also become a habit, because you just get in the habit of thinking that I can just cut off consciousness. Now, depending how conscious you are between the worlds, the mere act of suicide, you might not remember it strongly enough to learn right away. But sooner or later, you will figure out that this did not accomplish what I hoped it would accomplish, because nothing happens when you die. Everything that made you miserable is still there. I've been told, and I don't know how valid this is, but it makes sense to me, that if you try to solve the problem of consciousness by obliterating consciousness, then you have to keep coming back to that same point of choice and have the courage to make another choice. So that could also cause you to have continuously unhappy lives. I talked to one woman, it was very interesting, actually I've talked to 2 like this. One woman who this fits her personality. She told me that the thought of suicide was always in her mind. And we were just having a conversation about something that was a little difficult for her, and we were in a second-story room with a balcony. And she says, when you begin to tell me about this thing that I'm going to have to face, my first impulse is I want to go run and throw myself off the balcony. Yeah. And it was just her mental habit, which is that's how she had solved difficulties in her life for many lifetimes, is that if it was too much for her, she would just take her life. And it was very interesting because I have a lot of weird mental things, but throwing myself off the balcony, except in a kind of random way as people do, but it's not something I have to think about all the time. But she told me she has to constantly think about it, because it's a constant impulse within her, because it becomes a mental habit. It's one of the 3 delusions. That revelation turned out to be very helpful when I was talking to this other woman who also would always try to think of solving her problems with suicide. And she finally confessed it to me. She'd never confessed it to anyone. And she was so relieved when I told her, well, it's probably a habit from the past. She's not inclined to do it, but she was always thinking about it. I said, it's just a habit from the past, and now you're finishing it. So, which causes us to need to be very sympathetic to people who've committed suicide rather than judgmental. I mean, and we can also be sincere, we can be angry, we can be grief-stricken. You know, why didn't you tell me? How could you do this? Look at all the grief you've caused. You can be honest and authentic, but all it is a mistake. And all mistakes will be corrected in time. And just the person will not get what they hoped from it, and then now have set in motion. I think of it like this. I've come to think of karma as a debt to be paid, which is like if you use your Visa card and you accumulate big charges, suddenly you have this big debt, which is a burden on your life because you've taken whatever you've taken, your vacation, your restaurants, your fancy food, your car. You've taken all this, but you really haven't generated the energy to pay it. And so now you have this big debt. And now you're going to have to put out a lot of energy merely to bring the debt back to zero. So when we do things that are erroneous from the point of view of where our true happiness comes from, and we try to get happiness by drinking all the time, or by being a libertine, or by stealing somebody else's money, or by being angry at everybody, you know, you did all this to me. Now see, anger at everybody for what they did is the delusion of power. Because power goes both ways. Money, power, is I have power and I use it in a way, I use it either appropriately or I use it in a negative way. I don't have power and I become angry about that. So it's like, you know, I have it, I don't have it. We thought about this a lot in Israel because the Jewish people have been through so much, and there's the whole Holocaust event. It's a cosmic pattern where people are learning to work with power. So anger, because I'm a victim and people did things to me, is the Vaishya, the second caste, where I have to be able to make my environment what it should be, and otherwise I can't be happy. Now, woe unto him who misuses power against you. I'm not saying that such a person is innocent or is not without blame, but we would not have attracted it if we didn't have something to learn about the use and misuse of power and whether or not I'm really a victim. You see how subtle all of these things are? And I know how challenging all this is. My particular responsibility in life is to try to put these ideas out clearly enough so that we can get a clear concept in our mind, so even when we're off, we still know what's true. So I can be helpless in my anger, but I can also understand that eventually I'm going to have to get over it, because otherwise I'm just going to be drawn into another situation where I will feel powerless and be a victim and be angry until I understand the dynamics of power and how to use it properly, which is one of the three delusions represented by money. Does that make sense? Because here, and I was asked this question also, so we have these karmic debts, and where these debts are stored up is they're stored up in the chakras. And what they're stored up as is their vibrations. Every level of consciousness, from absolute ignorance to God realization, has a vibration, just like a piano. You know, they can tune the piano to the vibration of the note. So every level of consciousness has a vibration, and it corresponds to a chakra. Every time we put energy out in a certain way, if you commit suicide, as an example, it's a certain vibration of consciousness, which is pretty deep into delusion. However, people commit suicide for lots of different reasons. And Swamiji also said this, the reason you commit suicide also has a huge effect on what the karma is. If you do it out of anger and spite to get mad at those, to get back at those who hurt you, that's a certain kind of karma. If you do it because you're helpless and everybody's going to have to take care of you and you don't want to be a burden on them, that's another kind of reason. A woman that we knew committed suicide, but she'd been put on psychiatric drugs when she was a child, and she just didn't have her own brain anymore. And Swami said the karma of her doing that, it wasn't even her own action, it was just confusion on a lot of other levels. So it makes a huge difference why you do it, and also makes a huge difference how you respond as soon as you have done it, whether you realize it was a mistake or not. So you can't even know. A person could commit suicide and it could be the final act of some greater realization that could then lift him higher. Occasionally, suicide is also an appropriate self-sacrifice, but not too often. But sometimes that does happen. I heard of a very strange story yesterday, a true story of a man and his wife and daughter who were climbing on Mount Shasta, and they got caught in a terrible storm, and it was a whiteout, and they couldn't see their way anywhere, and they sort of got into a crevasse to protect themselves, but they were sitting on ice. And they were all, I mean, this is a very strange story. They were all going into hypothermia. So the father lay down and made the two women sit on him. And he died and they lived because he provided that much insulation and saved their lives. Now he's right there, he's just doing it. He's just saying, I'm going to deliberately give up my life so that my wife and daughter can live. And they did. So that's obviously a wholly different thing, but sometimes people do. Or even they may think they are doing it, which is quite different. Now, so everything that you do has a certain vibration of consciousness, which stores in the chakras, which is not passive. It creates a whirlpool. That's what a chakra is. It's a whirling wheel. And each of these things is a vritti. It whirls like this. Okay, this is about death. Because when our consciousness tries to leave, the ego is here, the spiritual I is here, and both of these points are strongly influenced by all of these vrittis. And these vrittis are created by us in this lifetime or in previous lifetimes, and it's an absolute picture of who we are vibrationally. What we're saying with our minds, what we think about ourselves, nothing. The truth is actually what we have done with our energy and who we have become. And because these are whirling vrittis, they suck in. So we start our concentration in a certain direction, but just like a leaf on a river, it just gets sucked into wherever the vritti is. So what happens to us is eventually we get the consequences of our own behavior, and we begin to notice that this isn't working. But we still have the vrittis, the habit of having done that so many times. So now a little bit of effort is trying to lift the leaf up to here. It gets held for a while, and then it gets eaten again by the vritti. And that's what happens to us, isn't it? We know that we shouldn't feel this way. I know I shouldn't do it. I know I shouldn't be like this. But somewhere in the house, a piece of chocolate is calling my name. And I just go and find it, you know, or whatever it might be. A wrong attitude is calling my name because it's a debt. We thought, well, this is my other way of thinking about it. Before you attain God realization, you have to try out every other alternate theory of happiness. You know, revenge, anger, victimization, suicide, you know, sadism. We have to try out every alternate theory of happiness and see if it actually works. Master said we try them all. And what that does is that creates a debt over here, because we've taken happiness in a way that really isn't happiness, and so we have to bring it all the way back to truth. And if it's a $10,000 debt, it's just not going to be paid off in a week, even though we're now putting $1 a week into it. But every time you try to do the right thing, then two things are happening. One is you're creating a higher, better vortex, and also you're not adding energy to the old one. So the mere fact that we rise a little and then fall, and then rise a little and then fall, doesn't mean that we're failing. It just means that the debt isn't paid. And eventually the debt will be paid, as long as we cut up the card and stop using it. Or even, and this is also very important, if we're not committed to that point of view anymore. Even if we're caught in it, we're not committed to it. And this is where Swami says, you maintain a little bit of mental detachment. You know, here I am running this tape again, being furious, you know, pounding on the walls, weeping, writing nasty letters that sometimes I even actually mail, whatever they might be. But some part of me knows that this isn't really working, that this is an alternate theory of happiness and I'm not committed to it. So I make a distinction in my mind between those actions I commit and those actions I'm committed to. And I try to keep it separated. I am committing this action, but I'm not committed to it anymore. I no longer believe this is really going to work. I still have to run this tape a little bit longer before I'm going to be free of it. Does that make sense? Now, this is all about how do you live in preparation for death. Because when your consciousness starts, literally you watch people die, you can watch the energy go right up the spine. That's why, when Tushti's little heartbeat was right here. I mean, there was no life force anywhere else. When I saw Linda Gerber die, she just was almost literally, you could almost literally see it. The energy just went right up her spine. And that you die from the extremities, just physiologically, because your energy withdraws into the spine and then it rises up the spine. And if you're very ego committed, you fall backwards through the medulla. If you're spiritually committed, you rise at least to some extent through the spiritual eye. And you're starting down the tunnel of light, and you start thinking about the outfit that you have on layaway. You start thinking about all the people you're angry with. You start thinking about all the people who can't get along without you, that you can't get along without. All of those things, and that will pull you backwards into the ego. And of course, very few of us actually are free enough to really exit without some ego, but whether we're completely eaten by egoic desires or whether we just take a few with us, it depends on what you've been doing all the time before. And we can't change what we've already done. Which is to say, whatever we were born into, we were talking about trauma, during the break, if you're born into a situation that instead of easing your trauma makes it worse, you realize, well, this is a big karma that I'm really needing to learn. And if it takes you your whole incarnation and you feel like you haven't made progress, but you've made a good fight, you can be certain that you're on your way out of it. I've also been very impressed. I first noticed this in my own life, that certain faults of mine, instead of being balanced by my upbringing, were made worse by my upbringing. And I thought to myself, how stupid. Why didn't I get born into a family that would mitigate them instead of exacerbating them? A certain intellectual pride and an over-commitment to words, just various things that relate to my being born into a Jewish family. A certain sense of superiority. We are, after all, the chosen people. Just stuff like that I really got to think about in Israel. And it was all made worse by my family, and it's been a struggle in my life to get out of those faults. But I realized, you never give up a fault until it's really so terrible that you're willing to put out the energy. And so oftentimes, instead of being relieved of what we have to get over, we're pushed farther into it. Because we have to be pushed all the way into it that we really are ready to get over this. Otherwise, it works well enough. Because as long as it's working, who's going to give it up? Yeah. Think about it. We never take anybody else's word for it, ever. Ever. Unless it already matches what we know. We learn from our experience, period. And as long as we can get away with it, as long as we can get away with the lower energy, lower consciousness alternative, we will keep using it. Because it's very, very hard to solve the problems of consciousness on the level of consciousness. So we must really know that there is no choice. And sometimes in order to do that, we have to be ground even farther down. So it's not a curse. It's a blessing, actually. Robin? Or Larry, did you have a comment?
I just wanted to say I heard you call it in the past the preference for the known misery.
Yeah, the preference for the known misery, right? The effort to change yourself seems more painful than to endure what you already have. And there has to come a point where the effort to change is more attractive than what I'm experiencing now. Robin?
There's something that I've witnessed in my own life, which is that there's patterns that I have to keep uprooting. And
Right.
one of them is the victim perpetrator.
Right.
Because it's so prevalent in our culture. Everyone wants to make people either victims or perpetrators. But really, it's a pattern of consciousness. And when we can extract it and be conscious of it and extract it out of ourselves, it helps around death, because death feels, in many cases, like a tragedy from our perspective. But if we can hold it as this is what is,
Exactly.
then we're not having to go into the drama of it, but we can just be present with the person in a much bigger way.
Yeah, definitely.
And in a more expanded way. At least that's what I've discovered.
Because also, I mean, these things are, they're just patterns of energy. There's just energy. That's the good news, that's the bad news. It's just energy. And energy can be affected by other energy. See, we could, in theory, we could be totally liberated in a heartbeat. All we have to do is put out as much energy toward God as we have put out toward delusion. Except most people can't do that in an instant. Most people, it takes a long time for us to pay that debt. But if we could pay that, if we could generate the money all at once and pay the debt off completely, we'd just be free in that moment. So, Viveka Devi, we have just a couple of minutes here. Yeah?
I was just reminded of the astral ascension ceremony as something that we can offer the souls who've crossed, or those of us who are here still, a way of relating to the soul in a positive way. I don't know if there's anything you want to say.
Oh no, the
about
astral ascension service basically just blesses. I mean, it's marvelous. You can look it up online, or Viveka Devi can give you a copy of it. In terms of helping people with death, it's just the most wonderful way to say goodbye to someone and to bless them in just the right spirit. It's something that if somebody is dying, I didn't talk much about, just being with people who are dying, but people reading the astral ascension multiple times before they die is also a really helpful thing that you can do, or you can do as a prayer. And it goes in all contexts. You can, for memorial services and so on, I mean, everybody loves it, because it's just so beautiful. It assumes the continuation of the spirit, but at funerals, people will let you do that. They might not over the dinner table, but they'll let you do it at the service. I think that our time has expired. Is that all right? Okay. Thank you all very much.